I'm Madison Miller, I'm 32. Just a few months ago, my husband Andrew lied to everyone that I was cremated in a private funeral service. But right now, I'm standing in a packed courtroom at an emergency hearing to prove I'm alive. My husband stands beside his family's attorney, both of them blocking the aisle like I'm a ghost who wandered in by mistake. The judge stares at the pile of papers, the death certificate with my name, the decorative cremation receipt they waived at the closed funeral. My doctor holds an affidavit, the nurse who kept my secret grips a sealed envelope, my private investigator cues the recording I made last night. I point at my husband, the man who told the world I was dead, and I say, "I'm the woman you thought you'd buried, but I'll use your lies to dig your grave." The room exhales, then leans in. Before I tell you how I woke up to a funeral held in my name and turned my husband's lies into evidence against him, tell me where you're listening from. Subscribe and switch on notifications for more family revenge stories. I built my life out of early mornings and stubbornness. My day used to start before the sun with black coffee that tasted like survival and the glow of a second-hand laptop that was more friend than appliance. I wrote my first lines of code at a rented desk in a room that smelled like toner and ambition, with a thrift store chair that pinched my hip and a calendar full of crammed deadlines. I learned to love small victories. A server that stayed up, a customer who didn't churn, an investor who said yes instead of maybe. I lived by lists, code reviews, stand-up meetings, investor calls, product launches, because the lists were predictable and the world outside them was not. My chief operating officer, Jordan, kept operations calm and sharp. He had a way of making chaos look like a problem with a plan. My chief financial officer, Daniel, kept cash honest and numbers clear. He could smell a missing penny from a mile away. Sophie, my best friend and my public relations person, could write a headline that softened the blow and sharpened the truth. Those people were my team. We had rules. Tell me the bad news first, protect customers, never fake progress. We grew because we kept promises, not because we chased the loudest applause. I rewarded honesty with raises and liars quietly got the door. At the start, I thought money was an armor that would stop everything that could hurt me. I wasn't naive about risk. I had coded my way out of too many disasters to be fooled by optimism, but I believed the metrics would carry me. Revenue climbing, retention steady, headcount reasonable. I wore my wedding ring like armor for a long time, letting its weight convince me that someone was holding the line at home as I held the line at work. I was proud, busy, and blind in all the ways that matter. I thought success would smooth everything. The cracks in conversations, the pauses before compliments, the small looks he gave me when someone praised my company instead of him. I thought my life's work would be my proof that I mattered, and for a while it was. He looked good beside me. In front of friends, he was easy grace, his hand on my back at galas, his smile when they asked how we met, the way he introduced me as if I were a prize he wanted people to admire. My husband would cradle my name with the kind of care that made you think he was proud. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted, though it always came wrapped in worry. He'd say, "You don't need to work that hard," while memorizing my passwords from my shoulder like he was cataloging the parts of me that made him feel less. His parents were like museum glass, polished, perfect, and at a distance you could not step across. Dinners with them felt like interviews where the questions were invisible. Fork position, dress length, which causes I supported. Somehow every detail was a test I didn't know how to pass. "You have a lot," his father said once, eyes on my hands and not on the person who owned them. "Family money survives by discipline." His mother smiled at photos and then leaned in with a whisper. "A woman with less to prove is easier to love." They were born into a world where money was a language and pedigree the grammar. I told myself it was a culture clash, it was control. I traded small pieces of myself for the quiet of their approval, a quiet that hollowed me out instead of filling me. I didn't notice the pattern beginning, little silences where there should have been conversation, his jokes that turned sharp when someone complimented my success, the way he started calling my schedule stress and mine called his advice concern. My company felt different. It was honest in the way a small town is honest, blunt and direct. Our hires were chosen for character more than charisma. I built from the ground up, a product that solved a problem and a team that would call me out when I got lazy. Jordan kept the engines running, he ignored the glamour and solved the plumbing. Daniel read the map of our money like it was a living thing. He could tell you what path a dollar would take and where it might get lost. Sophie handled the public voice. She could turn a mistake into a learning moment with a single paragraph. We had a faith in simple rules: promise customers you'll deliver, be honest when you don't, and protect the people who make it happen. The board liked our numbers. The board also liked a good name. My marriage was an asset in the room where deals were discussed, more valuable in the handshake than my actual ownership sometimes. People loved the story of a self-made founder who married into a respected family. I wanted to believe competence beat pedigree. I was right about half of that. Inside the company, I was attention and consequence. Outside the company, under the family roof, I became something to manage. That gap grew like weeds in a foundation, slow at first, then sudden, then dangerous. Pressure in my marriage rarely left a bruise you could point to. It sounded like concern, felt like help, and tasted like small betrayals. He forgot to add me to plans that mattered and then blamed my schedule. He suggested a joint account to simplify and then questioned every swipe I made like a man measuring my worth in dollars. His mother offered to help with estate planning with a smile that could have been kinder. Instead, it felt like a net with my name woven into it. His father explained legacy vehicles as if he were teaching me a lesson, but the lesson was always how to make me smaller. He suggested hiring a family friend as our company lawyer like it was a favor. I refused, and he smiled like I'd failed a test. He started checking in more, showing up without asking, standing by my desk with coffee in hand and thumbs that seemed interested in the open tabs on my screen. A key fob went missing at the office. I never asked who had it, and I replaced it without thinking. A location tracker appeared in my phone settings, and I blamed an update and turned it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. At a charity event, his sister laughed a joke about the fortune of silence while glasses clinked and everyone pretended the words were just a joke. I felt watched and told myself that being seen was love. The small things became the scaffolding for something bigger. Once you hand someone the ability to control your access, they start cleaning the picture around you. I kept shaving off pieces of myself to keep the peace, quietly giving up privacy, autonomy, the simple freedom to talk to my people without him listening. My ring got heavier with expectation and lighter with truth. I told myself again and again that silence was the price of a steady home. Silence cost me more than I ever imagined. Keys started to go missing. A spare fob vanished from my desk at the office, and I replaced it without asking questions because it felt easier than creating a scene. He showed up more in rooms I hadn't told him I'd be in, with coffee in hand and that look that was supposed to be caring. He'd say, "I'm just checking in," and I'd smile and let him because I believed the quiet at home was worth the checking. A family friend, his family's attorney, sent me sample forms one afternoon, all neatly typed. A living will, some notes about simple cremation wishes. She called it pre-planning like it was a party favor. I laughed and told her I had no plans to die young. She laughed too long and the words hung there like a question. At a charity gala, his sister made a joke in front of a crowd, a clink of glasses and a smile. "The fortune of silence," she said, and everyone laughed like a chorus because they didn't want to know the solo. The joke landed in me like a pebble in a pond, small, but the ripples reached farther than I wanted. Once, a man at the gym who I barely knew left a message that sounded like a personal invitation to a networking night. Another time, I found a note on my car windshield that said, "Be grateful," no signature, just the message. The tone of everything shifted. Polite interest turned to inspection, casual care to something that smelled like planning. There were other things I noticed only when I forced myself to notice. Documents subtly suggested as helpful, trays of forms left open on a counter with my name on them, questions about my estate asked with the tone of someone making conversation. I chalked it up to worry at first. I wanted to be generous and assume good intent. That's how it started, little surrenders that felt like peace until they piled up into a net I couldn't see. I didn't know then that the net was being woven with my own threads. The night of the crash felt like punishment and accident rolled into one long, awful breath. I was late from a meeting, the kind that runs because someone across a conference table suddenly remembers one more thing. My coffee went cold in the cup holder. The road was mostly empty, a highway stretching through low hills with only the yellow lines to keep you honest. Headlights appeared behind me and came too close, then drifted out and back like a heartbeat thudding against the glass of my rear window. I kept my speed steady, hands tight on the wheel, thinking about product launch copy and which investor had been polite and which had been interested. Then the brakes went soft. It wasn't a sudden failure so much as a betrayal, pedal down, and the car answered like it had been given a choice and decided not to help. The world tightened into a curve, guardrail flashing silver too close to blink. My wheel locked for one ridiculous moment. I remember thinking of the shelf of books in my office as if shelves would save me. Glass became confetti, metal a choir of groans. A face leaned into my window for a second, a shadow, a profile in cologne that smelled like cut lime, then everything went black as if someone had closed a book on the sentence of my life. Sirens stitched their way into my unconsciousness. Shoes crunched at my door, voices, one male, one female, said numbers like they were counting parts, not people. I had one last, small thought before the world went muffled, a to-do list, items half-checked, an email unsent. Then nothing, no sense, no hurt, just a long, soft nothing where time lost its edges. I woke into a room that felt like it had been stripped of my name. Machines were a low chorus, a refrigerator hum of beeps and breath. My limbs felt like rented clothes. A nurse with hands that smelled of soap and jasmine bent over me and said my name like it was something secret she'd been told not to share. Restricted visitors, she said, as if reading from a course on how to be careful with truth. Orders not to notify your friends. Her mouth made the sentence small, as if she didn't want it to echo. Your husband's instructions, she said, and watched my throat work like a puppet on a string. A doctor in a white coat, Dr. Reed, who would become a quiet hero later, checked my eyes and tapped a pen against a clipboard the way people tap their feet when they're nervous. He said, "You're stable," and slipped his card into the blanket beside me. His hand trembled just enough for me to notice. People who lie rarely tremble like that. I tried to ask who had been told, who had been invited, and my throat turned questions into dry paper. The words came out as a cough, as a scratch. No one would tell me the full picture, only that the outside world was being handled. Nora, the nurse, moved like she wanted to be somewhere else but stayed with me. She adjusted my pillow and called me by a name she seemed to love in private. "They asked us to keep this quiet," she said once, and her voice folded into the sheets. Dr. Reed kept checking my chart and making notes with slow, exact handwriting, as though writing it down might make it true or might save me from whatever was happening beyond the door. I lay there stitching fragments of memory into something that looked like a day, and the hole where my life was supposed to be felt raw and echoless. They had a funeral for me. Some people had a funeral because there's a ritual that comforts them. I had one because they decided to make me disappear. Nora, in a move that still makes me want to cry and laugh at once, slid a tablet into my hands and muted the sound. My face stared back at me from the screen, crowned by a black ribbon my friends had made into a profile picture. A service played out in clips and captions, a closed casket, flowers in exaggerated mourning, a man at the front who cried so well you'd have thought the grief owned him. My husband held an urn in his hands on camera, a decorative thing that matched the funeral drapes like a stage prop. The caption said, "Cremated by request." I had never written that request. Friends posted memories on social media with hashtags like "Gone Too Soon" and "Forever in Our Hearts." My team left comments with hearts and shocked emojis. My house was listed as pending sale. Bank alerts stopped. Company emails bounced. Access that used to obey my thumbprint suddenly required permissions I didn't have. The world blinked and called me gone. In the space where my life should have been, they filled everything with silence and an urn that wasn't mine. When I asked how far they'd gone, Dr. Reed didn't look at me like I was fragile. He looked at me like someone who'd been up late and seen things in the dark that didn't fit daylight. They made this tidy for themselves, he said. They made this final. Nora's knuckles went white around her coffee cup and she said, they have a cremation form with your name, but the place listed was closed that week. She didn't say the word forged, but the way she said it made the word hang in the air anyway. I could do two things. I could scream and wave my arms until someone took me seriously, or I could make a quieter plan. If I screamed, they'd call me unstable and lock my statements away like they'd locked my access. If I moved quietly, I could gather the leaves of the story before the wind scattered them. So I made a list: safety, allies, documents, copies, timing, exposure. I wrote it by hand on a pad the nurse gave me, the ink shaking as much as my hands. Each word felt like a rung on a ladder I had to climb to get out of the dark hole they'd dug. Nora helped more than she had any right to. She found me cheap clothes, an oversized hoodie that smelled faintly of bleach, and someone else's laundry plain sneakers that made my feet feel smaller. She and Dr. Reed untangled me from machines with a care that felt like undoing rope from around your throat. The IVs came out. I taped my own hair back in a knot that felt foreign to my face. They walked me to a service elevator, the one with a sign that said staff only and the smell of bleach and old rain. The elevator hummed like a low animal. The back door hissed open into the alley where the air was sharp with cold and city exhaust. I bought a prepaid phone with cash, the kind with minutes and a paper envelope. Nora watched the cashier while I tucked the phone inside my hoodie and held the change like a talisman. I saved exactly 3 numbers. Nora's, Dr. Reed's, Sophie's. I used a rideshare that took me under a different name and let me off at an unremarkable motel with a flickering ice machine and a janitor who nodded like he'd seen worse. I turned off my old phone, wrapped it in aluminum foil, an old spy trick, and slid it into a locker at a bus station with a coin and a curse under my breath. I picked a tiny gym back in the corner of the lobby and put a cheap hard drive inside it. I tucked the pad with my list into a book I couldn't afford to lose. I memorized rules like prayers: don't call from the same place twice, don't sleep where you plan, never use your real card, don't tell more people than you have to. Don't trust flattery that smells like instruction. I learned how to make my life look small and unremarkable so that it didn't invite hands. Staying small cost me a night of sobbing in the dark, a sound I let out once after no one thought to check the hallway. I choked on it, let it pass. The crying was a thing I wouldn't keep. It was a release and then a lesson. I slept with a lamp on and the TV playing an old sitcom for white noise, listening for tires on the road like a trapped animal listening for the sound of a hunter. Paper was the first armor I put on. Dr. Reed handed me copies of admission notes and daily logs, the kind of pages hospitals keep like a spine for the story of a person. The sheet that said restricted visitors had a signature that matched my husband's handwriting. Nora took pictures of the chart and texted them to me from the break room so it wouldn't look like anyone at the hospital was doing anything at all. We got itemized bills that went to the estate of me, line items for medication, room charges, a funeral home charge that made no sense. I stared at a cremation authorization that had my name spelled wrong and a signature that sloped left. My own signature lined right like the rest of my life. I made duplicates and hid them in 2 places. One set went into a cheap cloud folder under a nonsense name, something like holiday photos, so it would look like nothing to anyone who happened to glance. The other set went onto a hard drive wrapped in a towel in the bottom of my gym bag. I scanned everything into PDFs and emailed a copy to Sophie using a burner address and a sentence that said only, "If I disappear again, look here." I typed it into my phone with fingers that kept wanting to delete the words and then hit send like someone who decided to stop being polite to fear. When I finally called people, I did it carefully. I texted Jordan one word, "alive." It was a test. He called back immediately. His voice was that steady thing that made people lean in. I heard the relief and the shock and then the anger in his silence. Sophie picked up on the second ring and said one sentence that I wrote down because it was perfect. Say nothing I can't deny in public. Send me proof, she told me to breathe. Daniel sent me a line that said, if this is a joke, it's cruel, and I sent the funeral clip to his secure inbox. He called 2 minutes later and said, tell me where. We met at a busy coffee shop with loud steam and cheap pastries, the kind of place where people shouted into phones and no one looked twice. We sat at a corner table with our cups like shields. Jordan sliced his bagel slowly and said, they replaced your 2 seats on the board with temporary people your husband suggested. His jaw moved when he said temporary, like the word was a bad bite. Daniel set his phone screen face down and said, money moved in ways it shouldn't have. Consulting fees to companies that don't have employees, transfers to a box address that's the same as their office. He tapped the table and said it like a man who counted cash in his head and found holes. Sophie watched the door like a cat and tapped her pencil against a notebook. She said, we don't go public until we have the paper trail, we don't get emotional, we get specific. Her eyes read me like she was both afraid for me and angry enough to heat a skillet with her glare. We talked in plain sentences. Who would hold the files, who could verify dates, what to do if someone tried to bribe or threaten. We spoke about the board, about employees who might be vulnerable, about how a company feels when its leader is taken away and someone else uses your name like a stamp. Then Sophie's phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen, small nails picking at the corner of her cup. They're watching doors now, she said. Outside, through the fogged glass, a man sat in a rented car with a lens down and a hoodie. A camera's black eye focused on the coffee shop door like a predator deciding whether to move. The air in my chest tightened, an old animal memory saying, you're visible. Jordan looked at the window and then at me and said, we move faster than they expect. The words were a promise and a map. We left with our cups cold and the simplest plan, collect everything, keep it clean, and never ever play their game on their terms. Detective Carla pulled my crash file and read it until the edges softened. She is the kind of cop who keeps her coffee cold because she forgets to drink it when a case is good. She said the damage to my car didn't match any version of the story they'd handed in, and the pattern of impact made little sense with the idea of a simple accident. She didn't promise arrests, but she promised to follow every footprint. Grant got a witness to the attorney's faxing, a man who clocked the date and the time and swore he'd seen the attorney pay in cash. We cross-checked the number she sent the faxes to. One belonged to a cremation facility that, according to city records, was closed for renovation the week they claimed to have creamed me. That last fact hit me like a fist. Someone had created a receipt from a place that didn't even operate that week. It meant they'd thought of everything, even a detail as small as pretending to use a business that didn't exist at the time. It took a kind of boldness to fake that level of paperwork. It took arrogance to believe no one would look. That arrogance was their mistake. People with arrogance leave noise in their wake. We started listening for that noise. The first night after Grant's report, someone came to my motel room and tested the lock. My door frame had new scratches by morning, faint as breath but there, and I moved before midnight with the few things I couldn't live without. That kind of small terror organizes you. You pack with one hand and call everyone with the other, keeping your voice low enough to be polite but sharp enough to make sure they knew I wasn't bluffing. By the time I read the email that announced final asset transfer to a family trust I'd never agreed to, I was sitting in a coffee shop with a paper cup that had cooled and gone bitter. It felt like someone announcing on a public address system that they'd moved my life while I wasn't looking. That was the moment I realized this had never been about grief, it had always been about convenience. Peter came recommended by Daniel, who had been up late reading through bank statements with a flashlight and enough coffee to make him dangerous. Peter is a numbers man who hates mystery. He took the piles of bank printouts and receipts and stared at them until the lines became a map. He didn't use fancy words when he explained it to me. He made a pie chart and labeled the slices in plain language. They moved your money into pockets, he said, tapping a slice. Consulting fees paid to companies that look like nothing more than a name on a mailbox. Transfers that appear to be advice but are just a hand passing you empty envelopes. He pointed out insurance claims filed within days of my crash, claims that you file when someone is presumed dead. He said it simply, they acted fast because they wanted the money before anyone asked questions. One of the worst things was seeing my own signature in places it didn't belong. Peter showed me copies of shareholder votes with my name on proxy forms I had never signed. He drew lines between dates and told me, see these clusters? Clusters of transfers happened the same week as the funeral. The money moved in patterns that wanted to look like normal business but had the rhythm of someone who was pretending. Peter printed everything twice and labeled each stack with blunt sticky notes. Where, when, who. We hid one set of papers in a storage locker under Daniel's name and carried the other in a cheap lockbox that smelled like old metal and trust. He drew a simpler chart next. A flow of cash that led from my accounts to several small companies with shell addresses, then to personal accounts tied to the Campbells. It made me nauseous to look at it, as if my own life had been run through a blender and poured into their glasses. While Peter traced money, the walls began to squeeze. Jordan, steady, methodical Jordan, got an email from the board that said his behavior had been disruptive and that he was temporarily suspended pending review. He is the person who keeps us from burning down in a good idea. Taking him out of the room was like cutting the main cable on a bridge. When Jordan told me, his voice was small for once, but his fingers were steady when he said, I'll be back. Sophie got a call from a reporter, the kind who gets a story by dangling a rumor and seeing who bites. She told the reporter nothing apart from a simple, we have no comment at this time, and then called me and swore she wished she could tear people apart with headlines and not be the one to do it. A gossip site ran a blind item about a widower moving on, and the comments section lit up like a matchbook. People who never met me wrote what they'd like to be true. My bank cards froze. My apartment keys stopped working the night someone changed the locks and pocketed a set. The front desk left my mail in a box marked estate. An ATM printed out the story of my life in denial when I tried to check one last balance. My old phone, the one wrapped in foil, began buzzing inside that locker at the bus station, unknown numbers calling again and again. A black SUV started cruising around an address where I'd meant to meet Grant, he texted. Abort. We aborted. I slid into a new plan like it was armor. I stopped trusting the obvious things. If an elevator felt busier than it should, I took the stairs. If a park bench had fewer trash cans than usual, I sat elsewhere. The people sent to pressure me were patient, which made them more dangerous. Someone left a small envelope tucked under a door at Nora's house with cash and a polite note that said, "You misheard." Grant filmed Olivia, my sister-in-law, trying to hand a nurse an envelope at a cafe. Olivia smiled like Charity and her fingers looked practiced. We turned that footage over to Carla and she put bribery on the table. Watching the family work the edges of people's lives made me feel like I was living in a house with termites slowly taking the beams. Then, I decided to catch voices. If they were going to create records, I was going to make them speak where other ears could hear. I bought a small recorder that looked like a lighter and tucked it under a table at a dingy hotel bar where the family attorney liked to meet clients. Grant set it in place and gave me a grin that was both proud and old-fashioned. I told him to keep his phone quiet and his eyes open. At the bar, the attorney leaned back, glass in hand, and talked strategy like she would talk about a garden. I kept the recorder on and later we played it back in a room that smelled of stale coffee and hope. Her voice was clear. We need finality to stay final. Public doubt is risk. There was no hesitation, no moral stumble. It sounded like someone checking a box on a list they'd already printed. Dr. Reed handed me voicemails he'd saved from my husband. I listened to each one in the safety of a locked office where the blinds were always shut at night. In one, he said, cold and low, "We're ready to let her go. Prepare a statement." The timestamp matched a week when I was in no condition to make decisions. Hearing his voice like that was a proof that felt like a burn. Nora, bless her, remembered hearing Margaret, his mother, ask a staff member quietly, "How easy is it to move someone to a quieter ward?" That line made me feel like something small and precious had been auctioned off in a room I wasn't allowed into. Carla pulled traffic camera stills from the stretch of road where I crashed and found a face she recognized. A man who worked out at my husband's gym near my car the week before. It was a small thing until the man said, under questioning, that someone had paid him to check on my vehicle. One of the pieces in the puzzle fit another piece, and suddenly the picture grew teeth. We made 3 timelines: the crash, the papers, the money, and they all pointed back to the same house, the same hands, the same family. Those timelines were not just lines on paper, they were threads we could pull. The evidence felt like weight I had finally put down and could turn into something heavy enough to hold them. Every recorded phrase, every saved voicemail, every still from a camera was a kind of proof that could travel and land in a judge's hand and not evaporate under pressure. I didn't feel victorious so much as relieved to have the truth start to live out where it belonged, on paper, in files, in places people couldn't just sweep under a rug. The sound of their words, replayed carefully and sent to people who listened without fear, was the first real step back into the light. I narrowed my options down to 3 real choices. Run and disappear forever, accept a quiet deal and keep my dignity in a box, or hit them hard enough that they couldn't rebuild the walls they'd already burned. Running felt like losing on purpose, and I refused to hand anyone the shape of me. A quiet deal offered quick relief, less mess, a return to life that had been sanitized of shame, but I could hear the lesson it would teach other people who wanted to do this: don't get mad, let them take your name. The harder option was ugly and exacting. It would take time and cost sleep and safety, and people I wanted to protect would get scratched by the pieces. I thought of Jordan, who'd been suspended for simply asking questions, and of the team who kept the servers alive. I thought of Dr. Reed and Nora, who had risked their jobs by finding me an exit. The choice came down to whether I wanted to be someone who learned to breathe underground or someone who pulled everyone up with a rope. I chose the rope. It felt like walking to the edge of a roof and looking down at a crowd. There was a terror there, but also a focus. If I was going to move, I needed a plan no one could mistake for panic. The first act was to shake the tree just enough to see what fell. I called my husband once from a blocked number because sometimes the best way to know if a person will run is to see if they already think they've won. He answered, and the voice that came out of the phone was the same soft thing I'd married. I said, "I heard my own eulogy." He went quiet, then tried the old line, "This is cruel." I cut him off with one of the truths I'd been practicing. "You were supposed to stay gone." He did what most people do when faced with the wrongness they've committed: they bought time. "You don't understand," he said, voice lower now. "It had to be done." He kept pausing like he was choosing where to stab the truth so it wouldn't bleed too much. He said, "It's already done." I let him hear the rust in his own words. I recorded the whole exchange. He threatened lawyers and consequences and said things that were confessions if you listened to the pauses between sentences. I thanked him for the timestamps and hung up. That call was the ember I'd wanted. It proved he'd been involved, and it told him I was listening. The bridge burned because now he knew I wasn't afraid. Sophie and Carla each texted the same 2 words within minutes. Gold and go. Sophie arranged for a silhouette video filmed in a low-lit room with me sitting sideways, voice even and slow. I said, "I am alive, they know it. Here is proof," and held documents blurred enough to avoid airing everything but clear enough to show paper existed that contradicted what they'd sworn. Sophie managed the drop: 2 reporters who hated dishonest power and a podcaster who loved taking old reputations apart. We set a dead man's switch too. If I missed a check-in, every file I had would automatically ship to 20 different inboxes: media, investigators, friends who'd promised to forward it. I didn't like the idea of forcing fate, but the switch was insurance. It meant that if something happened to me, the story would not fade into rumor. Carla arranged an emergency filing to the court to freeze anything that looked like a sale or a transfer. She phoned a judge she trusted and asked for a short hearing just to confirm my status so no one could shove paper through in the dark. Daniel and Jordan began to gather the internal receipts and access logs they could get without making themselves targets. We synchronized it, hearing in the morning to put a legal pin in the balloon, board in the afternoon to show the company who ran the company, and the silhouette video released if the family publicly denied the facts. We set a chain of small alarms for ourselves. Sophie would post only if they lied. If they tried to threaten witnesses, the dead man's switch would go live. If the family tried to move money overnight, Daniel would give police immediate notice. I made an hour-by-hour map because chaos is less dangerous when it has times on it. At 7, I met Carla behind the courthouse in a shadowed doorway away from the cameras. She had a scarf over her coat and an expression that made me feel like the ground was harder than usual, in a good way. We walked in through a staff entrance where the security guard blinked and let us pass because he knew her, or perhaps because he guessed this was serious. At 8, Nora and Dr. Reed arrived with sealed statements and a stack of charts that had their edges clipped together. Their faces were more tired than I'd seen them, but when they handed me the envelopes I felt a small thread of steadiness. At 9, Grant delivered surveillance stills from the copy shop and the gym parking lot, and Sophie texted the silhouette video schedule. At 10, I was scheduled to testify in that little, echoing courtroom I'd stood in at the start of all this. I'd practiced my words until they felt like muscle memory, dates, simple facts, what I saw and what I did not. The point was to be so clear that no one could slide a rumor into the pause between sentences. I would say I did not sign these forms. I would show my own handwriting side by side with the forged versions. I would play the voicemail my husband left, the one where he said, "We're ready to let her go," and let the dates do the work. At 1 in the afternoon, the board would meet. Daniel would show the money flow, printed and simple, and Jordan would show access logs that proved someone had been pretending to be me on the back end of the company. We planned for one audio file to be held until 2:30, a recording of the family attorney, the one Grant had caught, speaking about needing finality. Sophie would release the silhouette video at 3 only if the family stood up in public and lied. If they denied, the video would go live and then my face would appear for an interview outside the courthouse at 4 where cameras would already be waiting. We built in contingencies. If Jordan was blocked at the office, Daniel would run the numbers from home. If Nora got a call that scared her, she was to notify Carla immediately and move to a safe location. If Grant could not be there physically, he had a backup who would deliver the physical evidence to the clerk of court. Sophie set a rule: no improvised interviews, no off-the-cuff answers. We would speak in plain sentences and facts that anyone could check. We were not looking for drama, we were looking for verification. I handed a hard drive to a cousin I trusted and looked at her like someone who was setting a baby down to sleep for the night and trusting someone else to watch. "If I don't call by 6, mail this to these addresses," I said, and watched the microcircles of worry gather and then smooth from her face. I hugged Nora like you hug someone who has helped you find a door and then walked away without stepping all the way through it. I told Dr. Reed quietly, "If anyone offers you money to change your notes, remember what you put down." He looked at me the way doctors do when they finally get to make a human choice and exhaled like he'd been waiting to do it. I put on a plain black suit that asked for nothing and gave everything. My hair was tucked back, no jewelry that could be noticed. Walking into that courthouse felt like walking into a bright room after months in the dark. The air mended itself around me with the sound of people moving paperwork. I was not the woman who wanted to be quiet anymore. I was the woman who had signed a document to say who she was and intended to keep that name. There was no turning back. The plan was tight, simple, and dangerous enough to matter. If I failed here, I lost my name. If I succeeded, I took theirs. Walking into the courthouse that morning was like stepping into clean air after months in basement dampness. The watchful faces, the shuffle of papers, the beep of a scanner, ordinary courthouse sound felt manufactured now, neat and predictable. I wore a plain black suit that didn't ask for attention and left my ring in my jacket pocket. It was a small, ceremonial sacrifice. My feet made a sound on tile that was so regular the echo made me feel better, like rhythm steadied my breath. The security guard checked my bag and barely looked up at my face. Detective Carla Monroe, met me at the staff entrance and leaned in for a second like a friend, not a cop. "Stay close," she said, not like a command but like an agreement. When the clerk called my case, I felt the room tilt in a way that said everyone expected a paper shuffle, not a woman. I walked to the front and looked at the judge as if I were naming two things at once: the person I was and the fact they had almost erased it. My husband flinched when I came in like he'd seen a ghost. His family's attorney, Victoria Kane, sat beside him in a suit that had no wrinkles and a smile that had been carved into its place. I felt none of the theater. I felt the facts folded into my hands and ready to be laid out like nails on a table. I said simply, "I am the person on these documents who is listed as deceased. I am breathing." They lied. The words felt like the first steady step across ice. Nora was the first to speak for me. She told them about visitor restrictions and how someone had asked staff to keep things private in a way that meant doors stayed closed. She described the tablet she'd slid me with my photo and the black ribbon and how the message had been muted as if it were a thing she wasn't supposed to witness. Her voice wavered only once, and I saw the judge's eyebrows hitch like a man who wanted to lean in. Dr. Reed took the stand next. He laid out the small things that made the difference: my chart with continuous care, notes with timestamps, no call from the hospital declaring a death, orders that read restricted visitors with a name beside them that matched my husband's handwriting. He didn't wave a flag or call them liars. He placed evidence on the table with a steady hand. When he explained that my record never read deceased, the room contracted in the way a lung feels when someone coughs in it. The judge held the papers and tapped them, looked up at my husband like a man trying to match voice to face. We played the voicemail my husband had left, one of the ones Dr. Reed had saved. His voice was low and clipped on the recording, the kind of voice people use when they're talking to someone who can't argue back. "We're ready to let her go," he said, and the date stamp that flashed on the small courtroom speaker matched a week when I was in no shape to sign anything. There it was, the sound of the plan admitting itself. The judge looked at the attorney and then back at me like a man tracing a path through fog. He tapped a sheet with his pen and said in a voice that made the room quiet, "This court orders the records corrected. Miss Miller is to be recognized as alive for all legal purposes pending further review." The words landed like a bell. It was procedural, careful, but it changed everything at once. From the courthouse, we went to the boardroom. Walking into that glass-walled space felt like stepping onto a stage where every seat had a story. A few directors were already there, hovering like the kind of people who roll their eyes when a scene grows dramatic. One older director muttered, "This is a circus," and for a second I almost laughed because the circus had been in their living rooms for weeks and I'd been the main act without being asked. Daniel stood with a laptop and a stack of papers. He clicked through slides that showed the money moving in language that was simple, where funds had gone and when. He didn't use complicated phrases. He showed a line that began in my account and branched into smaller boxes with names that meant nothing. Consulting, advice, administrative fees, words that blurred until you looked closely. "These addresses are mailbox services," he said. "These transfers happen the same week as the supposed funeral." He put a photocopy of a cremation receipt from a facility that was closed the week it claimed to cremate me next to a hospital chart that showed I received medicine on the day of the funeral. It was the jolt of contrast that made people stop pretending. Jordan, steady even under pressure, pulled up access logs on the company's servers. He showed how my credentials were removed the day after the crash and replaced by administrator overrides coming from an IP address that traced back to the family's office. He put up a timeline that matched each step: lockout, transfer, funeral, sale, like dominoes. The room had been waiting to choose between keeping a story tidy and keeping a company intact. I watched the faces shift. People who had said nothing started to look at one another and calculate risk differently. I spoke when they looked at me like they might need permission. "You can keep the lie or you can keep this company," I said. It was blunt and true. The vote was quick. The board voted to reinstate me as chief executive officer and to suspend the proxies that the family had put in place. They voted to lock external access and hand control back to an internal team led by Daniel and Jordan. It was not a dramatic moment of confession, it was a pragmatic choice. They chose the company. They chose customers over comfort. That was the victory that mattered. The door closed on them not with a shout but with the slow, clinical work of people who know how to collect things that don't belong to them. Detective Carla arrived with uniformed officers who moved like a calm tide. They took the forged forms, the cremation receipt, the thumb drive with the recorded attorney and put them into evidence bags with neat labels. The family attorney tried to leave, a briefcase swinging, but Grant blocked the elevator and handed over chain of custody envelopes like a man who'd been taught how to keep truth from bleeding. He didn't say a word. He only made sure the packages were sealed and witnessed. My husband stepped toward the solicitor and tried to murmur, "We can fix this," like it was a promising problem you could smooth with apologies. He looked small. "We just did," I answered, and the words felt like placing a lid. Officers escorted him out for questioning. His parents, Margaret and Charles Campbell, were told not to leave town. They paced a little, their shoes making quiet sounds, and then they sat with the kind of stunned calm people wear when they are rewriting the script in their head and are 2 pages behind. Outside, Sophie texted 2 letters. "Live." The silhouette video Sophie had made went out like a fuse. It landed with a thud on social feeds that had been patient for a scandal and hungry for it. The silhouette appeared first, then blurred documents, and then, as expected, my face did a few hours later in an interview outside the building when the cameras had waited long enough to see if the family would deny. Reporters asked the same hungry questions about motive and greed. I answered simply in sentences that sounded like steady rope. "I'm not back from the dead, I was never gone, they just needed me to be." That line felt right. It stripped away melodrama and left the truth. I had been made invisible and no one had asked permission. People taking my hand afterward felt relief rather than celebration. Employees who had sat at their desks and watched their leader vanish, people who had been patient and brave. I felt tired in the way a marathoner does after a finish line. The fight had been a long, slow thing and the courtroom win wasn't the end, only the first clear place where the light cut into the dark. But it was enough. For the first time since I'd opened my eyes in that hospital room, I felt like I could breathe without counting the cost of each breath. I didn't have time to be angry about the tone. I had to be strategic about the effect. Sophie and I put out a simple, clean timeline, 5 dates, 5 documents, and nothing flashy in the language. No accusations, just sequence. We labeled each item plainly, date, event, who handled it, and we released scans of the originals where possible. The point wasn't to shout, it was to make the story a set of verifiable facts people could check themselves. That was my anchor, keep the truth simple enough that it could be repeated without getting bent. In the morning, my company stock dipped, people smell chaos in numbers, but by afternoon it steadied after an employee town hall where I spoke plainly. I told the team what I knew, what we were doing, and what I needed from them. I didn't dress the truth up. I said, if anyone pressures you to lie, call this number, and I gave Detective Carla's direct line. That was another anchor, a line straight to someone who took action instead of talking. Employees liked the directness. People need instructions in confusion. They need someone to say, "We will protect you if you tell the truth." I felt the team breathe a little easier when I offered a clear path. We set daily updates at 9 each morning, what we knew, what we didn't, and what we were doing that day. My point was to bury rumor under routine. Routine makes chaos predictable and therefore manageable. I asked Sophie to keep the public voice boring, no drama, no winks, just short statements that pointed back to the documents. That quiet, boring voice ended up being more dangerous to the Campbell's story than anything volatile we might have tried. People trust steady more than noise. Steady became my anchor. It kept the room from spinning and made their spin look like theater. New constraints showed up fast. Partners froze some deals until leadership issues settled, which meant cash flow hiccups and nerves. We answered by splitting deliveries into smaller batches so customers still got product. Smaller batches meant fewer checks, fewer opportunities for someone to say our supply was unreliable. I assigned Daniel to co-sign any payment over a certain small amount so two people had to see every big move. That was a simple fix, but it was effective. Two eyes on a thing make it harder for one person to hide a hand. Jordan rebuilt access lists from scratch. It took days of pulling accounts, changing passwords, and replacing admin privileges that had been quietly shifted away from internal control. Anyone added in the last 3 months was reviewed. It was boring, tedious, and necessary work, like cleaning mold from grout. You don't see the difference until everything is clean, and then you can breathe without wondering what will crumble next. We also set a rule that no single person could move company funds without 2 signatures. That redundancy slowed things down, but it also stopped quick thefts. The family tried to file an emergency motion asking the court to block me from speaking poorly of them, an attempt to muzzle the truth by calling it something excess. The judge denied it, saying it was an overreach. That denial gave me breathing room. I slept less and ate less, but at least I did both on purpose. I hired 2 plainclothes security guards who looked like baristas and thought like chess players. They sat in coffee shops and read books and watched windows. They kept their distance and reported anything that smelled like trouble. The personal cost of these steps was real. I slept in 15-minute stretches if I was lucky and ate snacks standing up. Nora texted reminders to drink water. I listened to those reminders like they were orders from a general. We tightened communications so that employees had both chain of command and a way to speak to law enforcement without anyone in between. That dual path protected people who might otherwise feel pressure to pick family loyalty over facts. Those new moves narrowed the space for the Campbells to work their influence, and every closed door they faced made them more nervous and more likely to make mistakes. They got clumsy when they were nervous. Olivia approached Nora in a cafe one day and tried to slide her a small envelope with a practiced smile, like the act was both casual and generous. Grant had a camera 2 tables over and recorded the whole thing. Nora's surprise, Olivia's fingers folding around the envelope the way she said, "You must have misheard. These things are confusing." The footage was ugly in the best way. It showed them doing the thing they hoped to pretend never happened. We took the footage to Detective Carla. She filed it and moved the case from rumor to an actual line item, bribery. That phrase made people sit up. We also found a gym friend who had been quiet until pressure mounted. He came forward and admitted he'd been paid to check my car the week before the crash. He named who gave him the money. A private mechanic we traced confessed under the weight of evidence that parts had been swapped. He showed receipts and texts that tied him to a man from the family's circle. The smell of oil and metal in his garage made the story feel real in my mouth. Carla moved quickly. She secured the garage owner for questioning, and when he heard felony mentioned, he started to talk. People start to sing when they think they can stop the music as it pleases them. He gave names, dates, and small details like the brand of the brake pads that were swapped that matched the rest of our timeline. It became a web that went from tiny threads to a net. Each person who turned gave us another piece, and the pieces fit together in a way that felt like correcting a bad puzzle. The more the net tightened, the faster the Campbells' moves became desperate. My husband tried to get on a small plane at a local airstrip, one of those places where you don't show up at a gate and wait for a machine to tell you the time. Officers met him at the ticket counter with a "Do Not Depart" notice and a printed order. He stood for a moment with a suitcase in one hand and a face that went colorless like paper. I felt a complicated thing watching him, vindication mixed with fatigue. He was led away for questioning. The airport smelled like fuel and hot metal and a life trying to speed off it. His parents tried to move jewelry and cash to a storage unit in the next county. A storage facility manager looked bored until he saw the names on the papers and the odd way the boxes were packed. Motion cameras there caught Charles and Margaret carrying boxes labeled with dates that didn't match the paperwork they gave the manager. He called it in. We had footage of someone who had the wrong story trying to tell the right one. The family attorney, sensing the tide, resigned to reduce distraction and then, in a move that betrayed her own nerves, hired a private lawyer within hours. It was a small, loud sign that they were closing ranks. I sat down with Carla for a formal statement and named dates, voices, and places. I spoke in plain sentences. When I was in the hospital, who asked for restricted visitors when the cremation form appeared and where the money moved. I didn't embellish. I kept it direct so the police could use it without needing to interpret any bitterness. Sophie prepped me for my first long interview by rehearsal. No gossip, no emotion, just facts laid out like tiles. We practiced how to pause so I didn't fill silence with drama. We scheduled a bonus for employees who had held the company up through the chaos, and we paid it on a Friday morning at 9:01 to make a small, public point. We keep our promises. As the net cinched, I felt both relief and a strange sorrow. Names were being spoken aloud now, and that meant the story I'd lived in private had come into the open. It meant protections for people who had been pressured, chances to fix the holes they'd been forced into. It also hurt those who'd been close to me and had to know the messy truth. The cost of justice is often small and private heartbreaks. I promised silently to make the aftermath less sharp for the people who'd risked themselves for me. The rest I would let the law and the public unravel. I had built a ladder and people were climbing up it. The net we set had made sure the Campbells couldn't slip out the back door as easily as they'd planned. I read the draft they sent like you read a poisoned menu. Lines like mutual confidentiality and avoiding further reputational harm were their way of pretending we all had the same interests. The board murmured about how a quick settlement might steady the stock and stop the press. Jordan wanted the clean break. He said stability helps the company and people will sleep better. Daniel looked at the numbers and calculated how long it would take to get us back to a safe place. Their arguments were sensible and slow like steam, and they smelled like safety. Part of me, the frightened part that had been sleeping in 5-minute fits for months, wanted the offer. It promised less noise, less sleep loss, a return to a life that wasn't a courtroom calendar. My husband wrote me a letter that he hoped would sound like contrition. "We can end this quietly," he wrote in careful handwriting that had always looked better when it tried. "No one needs to know everything." He offered his version of atonement and a future where our names might sit beside each other in polite headlines instead of in crime reports. I taped that letter to the wall in my sublet and labeled it, "The Old Me Would Fold Here." For a minute, I looked at the neat loop of his Ys and thought about the years before everything changed, dinners where he kissed me like a shield, mornings when his voice sounded like home. I felt the temptation like hunger. It would have been so easy to accept a quiet box and slide back into life with less noise, but I kept thinking about lessons you teach people by your choices. If I took the offer, what did that teach anyone who came after me? That a plan like theirs could work if done carefully, that if people were clever enough they could erase someone and not face the consequences. I pictured one of our engineers, quieter by nature, being coerced because they thought everyone would fix the problem quietly afterward. I thought of Nora and Dr. Reed and how much courage it had taken them to protect me. I could not bargain away accountability to buy peace for myself when the cost would be other people's safety. So I did something small and deliberate. I scanned the letter and the settlement draft and saved them to 3 places. I told Sophie to be ready with the silhouette video and to push it if negotiations went public. I called Carla and said, "If they offer a hush, refuse it. We need a hearing." She answered with the steady voice I'd come to trust. "We'll move forward." I set the draft in a drawer and let the paper sit there like a thing that would not go away. Grant found the footage I'd forgotten about, home security clips from months before the crash that showed my husband with a spare key and in the garage late at night. He handed me a flash drive with the files like a man passing a match in a dark room. The images were small and grainy and undeniable. One clip showed him slipping the key into his pocket with a calm hand. Another caught him in the garage wearing the same jacket captured by the traffic camera the week my car was tampered with. When I watched those tiny moving images, something inside me uncoiled. The offer with its bandaged apology suddenly looked like cowardice. I walked into the courthouse and felt different than I had the first time. The air held less hope and more purpose. I practiced testimony in a mirror until the words were flat and simple: dates, facts, names. I sat with Daniel and Jordan and told them if anything came to me that felt like pressure, they should take a photo and send it to Carla immediately. I told Sophie to prepare the journalists with the kind of documents that made their editors nod and their fact-checkers sleep. If I'm scared, I told Sophie that night over instant coffee, run the tape. She smiled and said, we run it either way. The choice was no longer only about me. It was about whether a family could buy silence with money and get away with it. When I finally let a public lawyer speak to us, I did it with a clear boundary. I would listen to offers, but I would not be bought. I refused to let fear make me small. The point of bringing the truth into light wasn't to ruin the lives of those who had been misguided. It was to hold the people who'd planned this accountable and to ensure nobody else could be erased the way I nearly was. The offer that insulted me had a clear purpose: keep a legacy polished and prevent questions. I decided I trusted the law more than their promises and the court more than their deals. That decision tightened everything into a simple direction: truth, no matter how long it took. The court entered my testimony and the evidence we collected like a steady drumbeat that settled the room. My husband pleaded guilty to charges that carried real prison time. Hearing the words out loud, him admitting the act, was both a release and a new kind of wound. It meant the truth was confirmed, and it also meant we all had to live with the image of him choosing to do this. His parents faced fines and restrictions and the slow closing of doors that always matters more than money: invitations, trust, relevance. They lost more than cash, they lost the easy access they'd always relied on. I kept the company because it mattered to me and to the people who worked there. I gave up the house and everything that lived inside it without a second thought. The house was a shrine to a life that had been half performance, half prison. It had memories I didn't want to sleep with anymore, portraits that watched me like jury. I signed over the property with a relief that surprised me. Handing it away felt like cutting a rope to freedom. I promoted Jordan to president and Daniel to executive vice president. I put rules in place that sounded obvious but had saved us. 2 people must sign off on major moves. Any change in leadership gets logged and backed up in 3 places. Those small practical rules were my way of making a structure that couldn't be toppled by private wills. I sent Nora a scholarship for her daughter's school and a note that told her she could call any time she needed a letter of recommendation or a place to stay. I wired a donation to the hospital for patient comfort in Dr. Reed's name and told him to use it where it would matter most. Those were not attempts to buy gratitude, they were my way of paying back kindness that had been risked for me. I took one day off and sat in a park with no phone. I ate a sandwich and watched kids chase pigeons and tried to taste the simple fact of being alive without thinking of schedules, litigation, or the way headlines might read. Walking back through the courthouse corridor where this all began felt different. Sunlight found the dust in the corners and made it look like gold for a second. A reporter asked if I forgave them. I answered without theatrics: I built a life. That's enough. Forgiveness felt like a thing too soft for what had happened. Building felt like an action I could live with. I passed a donation box for victims of violent crime and slid in a folded check without a name. It was small and private and felt right. I called my team from the courthouse steps and said, "Back to work, we build forward." They cheered in a way that didn't sound like victory but like people glad the work would keep them fed and awake in a better way. My hand on the glass door of my office felt different that day. I didn't need a ring to steady me. My life was mine again, complicated and still slightly scarred, but no longer invisible. If you stayed with me to the end, tell me where you heard this, subscribe, and leave a comment with your story.